welcome back to Learning at VS for Leaders. In the last episode, we spent some time exploring self-leadership, what it means, why it matters, and how it begins with awareness of ourselves before we lead others. This week, we're going to build on that foundation by exploring the idea of values and the important role they play in how we lead, make decisions, and show up at work and generally in life. Values are one of those things we often talk about, whether it's organisational values, personal values, team values, yet we don't always stop to really explore what they mean for us as individuals or how deeply they influence our behaviour. So this episode is an invitation to pause again, to reflect, and to consider how understanding your values can support your self-leadership in meaningful and practical ways. At a very simple level, values are the things that matter most to us. They act like an internal compass, guiding our actions, priorities, and behaviour, often subconsciously, without us realising how they're impacting our behaviour and driving how we show up in meetings when the pressure's high, and in those quiet moments of decision making. Values tend to represent what we see as right, meaningful, lofty. Unlike a goal, which might change depending on the context, values tend to be more stable, rooted in our upbringing, culture, and early experiences. Values are not about what we want to achieve, but why we care. So when our actions align with our values, things tend to feel more coherent. We might feel more energised, more grounded, or more confident in our decisions. When they don't, we can experience discomfort, frustration, or just a sense that something isn't quite right. In the area of leadership, this misalignment can show up in lots of different ways. It might be indecision, the feeling of emotional fatigue, tension in relationships, or that sense of being constantly pulled in different directions. Understanding our values doesn't remove complexity, but it can help us navigate it with greater clarity and self-compassion. Self-leadership is closely connected to values because values influence why we do what we do. If I asked you to list or articulate your values, you'll probably reel off a list of things that are important to you. Things like honesty, caring, manners, social justice, that sort of thing. But if I ask you which you value more than another, that's when things can start to get a bit hazy. If we spend some time gaining clarity for ourselves and our values, as leaders we can gain some powerful revelations on things like what we prioritise, what we tolerate and the culture we set for our teams, where we place our energy and how we make sense of difficult situations. When we're clear on our values, we're often better able to make decisions that feel aligned, even when those decisions are hard. When we're unclear or when our values are in conflict, leadership can feel uncomfortable or draining. We might notice ourselves overthinking, seeking reassurance, or feeling stuck. This is particularly relevant in trauma-informed work, where we're often navigating complexity, emotion, and competing needs. In these moments, our values can act as an anchor, not by giving us perfect answers, but by helping us stay grounded in what matters most. We'll all be familiar with the values of victim support: integrity, compassion, accessible, resolute, and empowering. These are important for the organisation and offer a shared sense of direction, joining us together as an organisation and creating a powerful mission that we can buy into. But personal values live a little deeper. They show up in moments like when you're under pressure and need to decide what to prioritise, when you feel torn between two equally important demands, when something doesn't sit right and you can't immediately explain why. Values often reveal themselves emotionally before intellectually. You might notice frustration, discomfort, or even a sense of loss. It's important to notice this, as this is often a signal that something important to you is being challenged. Let's pause for a moment. You might like to reflect on a recent situation that felt particularly satisfying, or alternatively, particularly difficult. gently ask yourself, what was important to me in that moment? Which of my values felt honoured or perhaps compromised? How did that influence how I showed up? There's no need to judge your response. This is simply about noticing patterns with curiosity rather than criticism. Living in line with our values doesn't mean things are always comfortable or easy. In fact, sometimes acting in line with our values requires courage. For example, setting boundaries, having honest or challenging conversations, or making decisions that might not please everyone. But values can be a source of steadiness. When we know what matters to us, we often feel more grounded in our choices, even when those choices are challenging. This is especially important in leadership, where our actions, intentional or not, influence the people around us. When leaders act in ways that feel congruent and authentic, it builds trust and psychological safety, even in uncertain times. There may also be times when living in line with your values feels difficult or even impossible. Workload, systems, competing demands, or emotional fatigue can all get in the way. In those moments, self-leadership isn't about pushing harder. It might be about noticing what's missing, naming what feels out of alignment, or offering yourself some compassion. Sometimes self-leadership is simply recognizing that you're doing the best you can with the resources you have right now. Understanding your values isn't about having a perfect set of principles or always getting it right. It's about developing awareness and getting curious, noticing what matters to you, how that shows up in your leadership, and how you might honour those values more intentionally over time. As you move through this coming week, we invite you to spend some time reflecting on your values, and a guided reflection is attached, giving you some guided questions to think about and aid you in discovering more about your values. In our next session, we'll be building on the idea of self-awareness and exploring a useful tool for bridging the gap between how we think we're perceived and how we might actually be perceived by those around us and, importantly, those we lead.